Welcome on in to the 2024, the 38th edition release of the Baseball Forecaster. This is our annual release party at this point. I believe this is the third or fourth year that we've done this in a row to coincide with the shipping of the hard copy version of the Baseball Forecaster. For those of you that have your annual renewals, we did get the PDF version out to you by Thanksgiving, which is always one of our huge deadlines. But the actual paper book is out there, smelling good, presumably. I don't have my copy yet, but it is out there. We have seen it in the wild. We have seen I don't want to say complaints, but we have seen other folks say they're still waiting for theirs, and we've got multiple. We've got Ron with his. That's good. The founder should have his book, as he does, and then Ray's got it. I would assume Brent has his copy. Ed's sitting there with shaking his head. So that's we're 3 out of 5 among
there are reports out of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, of a lost pallet of books. By the way, so
a lost pallet. Who do we need to send to find it?
We got to find our subscriber who's nearest to the post office in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and tell them to go rattle some cages.
Anyone in the live stream that lives in Wisconsin, we may have a side job for you to take care of this year. All right, formal introductions before we get going. I'm your host. I'm Ryan Bloomfield, one of the associate editors of the Baseball Forecaster. We also have, of course, Ron Shandler, the founder, the namesake of this book, of the 38th, like I said, edition. I can remember that because it's always the same age as me. I'm 38, and that is the 38th edition, so I won't forget that. We also have our 2 editors, Ray Murphy and Brent Hershey. How we doing, guys?
Doing awesome. It's a great night.
Doing well. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you.
And then special guest, our director of research, who also put together 2 pretty fantastic playing time analytics essays, which we'll go into in more detail tonight. That is Ed Diaria. Ed, what's up, man?
Hello. Good to be back.
Before we begin, just a couple kind of, housekeeping items, but we want this to be interactive. So obviously this is on the Baseball HQ YouTube channel. If you don't mind liking and subscribing to the YouTube channel, we're going to try and do more and more of this type of stuff throughout draft season. And there's a chat on every YouTube live feed. There's a chat on the right side. So we welcome your comments, your questions. We've carved out some time for Q&A at the end of the program tonight. But if there's pressing questions or comments that I see throughout, I can throw them up on the board or up on the screen, and we can kind of chat through that as we go. So would appreciate any and all interaction that we can get from the listeners out there. So with that, here's our tour of the 2024 Baseball Forecaster. We're going to lead off with Ron, as usual, who wrote his introduction called One Off, a very interesting look at our cover boy, Ronald Acuna Jr. And then I talked about this a little bit earlier, but Ed's going to go into a little bit more detail on the pair of essays that he wrote for this year's book, which I think are just, fascinating enough to carve out its own section here in tonight's release party. And then Ray and Brent are going to kind of tour you through some of their favorite boxes, key in on certain players, certain stats, and kind of walk you through kind of that process. In doing so, how we come up and write some of these commentaries. So we've got some of my favorite player boxes, Q&A, and we also, this is not in the agenda, a late add to the show, a special treat for you at the end after Q&A for subscribers to Baseball HQ. Brent wrote a GM's Office column, I don't know, about a week or 2 ago.
About that, yeah.
Breaking the news that we are working on a brand new BaseballHQ.com. And what we want to show you tonight are just to whet that appetite a little bit. Ray has a couple screenshots that we want to show you of the new website. So exciting things ahead. But first off, Ron, I'm going to send this over to you and have you talk through your introduction of the 2024 Baseball Forecaster One Off.
Okay. It's interesting, Ryan. Thank you. It's interesting that you know how many editions of this based upon how old you are. I also know how many editions of the Forecaster is because 38 is the number of years that I'm married. And this way I can never forget that
There we go.
Yeah. So, yeah. So there's that.
Also convenient. You will never lose track of that number. So that
Never
works.
lose track. Never lose track.
Yep.
All right, you can put that whole screen up there, Ryan. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. In evaluating what happened in 2023, and looking forward to 2024, everything begins and ends here. I want you to gaze at these numbers. I mean, for a few minutes, you just have to look at these. They are magnificent. Look at the elite power, the uber elite speed, all the collateral counting stats these skills generated last year. That batting average in an age of scarce 300 hitters, and those plate appearances. My God, this was an amazing performance in every conceivable level. In fact, the $63 there he earned in rotisserie dollars was the highest earnings of any player during the rotisserie era since 1980. The next highest earner, Larry Walker, a mere $55 season in 1997. But this was better than Barry Bonds' 72 homer season. It was better than Ricky Henderson's 130 stolen base season. And our $63 valuation might actually be on the low side. RotoWire and Fangraphs had him at $66 and $69 respectively. Razzball had him at an astounding $71 in earnings. In fact, their player rater, which has values going back to 1903, has Ronald Acuna's 2023 season as the greatest rotisserie performance of all time. Better than Babe Ruth in 1921, better than Ty Cobb in 1909, better than Honus Wagner in 1908. And perhaps even more amazing is that these stats were real. They were fully supported by his skills metrics. His average was not inflated by BABIP. His contact rate was 87%, a 14% spike from 2022, which who does that? And his power metrics indicated that he might have underachieved this year. All of this, all in all, it was an absolutely historic performance. But we look at these numbers now and we have to wonder, where does it go from here? Now what? What is Acuna going to do in 2024? Well, the most obvious expectation for next year will rely on regression and gravity, because those are the two strongest forces known to man, as we know. But how far could Acuna really fall? Well, another season of 700 plate appearances seems like an obvious place to start. But here's the thing. Even if we can expect a couple of IL stints to cut out, I don't know, maybe 100 plate appearances, he still puts up enough numbers to maintain a rotisserie value over $50. And that's just astounding. But the way I see it, there's a problem in looking at future value this way. And the way I start looking at this is first to go back a year. Let's say last year at this time, and we were thinking about what Aaron Judge might do after his 62 home run season. Nearly every prognosticator going into this past year landed on a projection somewhere between 44 and 48 home runs. And their underlying assumption was that since he had stayed healthy for 2 consecutive seasons, Judge had achieved a new health baseline. But as we know, good health is rarely ever a stable or realistic baseline, especially for a player like Judge, who had a previously spotted injury history. So every player at best is a 50-50 bet to spend time on the IL each year. So regressing Judge's 62 home runs to say even 44 was a projection driven by an expectation of good health, which is not a realistic point of reference. So, and as we know, Judge got hurt and only hit 37 home runs. But that's really only the first reality check for Acuna. More important, I think, was that 2023 in itself was an anomalous year. There were a series of rule changes, as we know, that affected the entire game. Stolen bases were up 40%. The pitch clock changed the pace of play, defensive shift limitations, even the balanced schedule, all had somewhat of an effect on the stats in one way or another. all these variables had teams and players kind of feeling their way around, not knowing what to expect or how to react. So we have to ask the question, what if 2023 was just a test year? What if it was a year when the teams were just dipping their toes into the new rules pool, checking the depth, checking the temperature to see exactly what they were dealing with? What if 2023 was just a one-off, and now with an off season to review and analyze and adjust, then 2024 might look completely different. Perhaps 2024 might be a more viable baseline to project future seasons. So if that's the case, then maybe we can't take the 23 data that seriously. We can't use these stats as a point of reference and then regress them to calculate what 2024 would look like. We'd have to start at zero basically and build back to a more realistic expectation based on underlying skills, because that's what we do here, and not look so closely at what might be potentially outrageous stats of 2023. And really, that's what we should be doing every year, is starting at zero. When you think about it, and this gets a little philosophical when it comes to statistics in general. When you think about it, every player's final stat line is almost an arbitrary stopping point along a continuum of possibilities. These final numbers, 41 homers, 73 stolen bases, 337 batting average, they describe a unique confluence of events driven by underlying skills, but shaped by health, by ballpark dimensions, by wind currents, and the particular assortment of pitchers that player faced during the season. All of that comes together and builds towards a stopping point on the final Sunday of the season. That's what happens every year. But in 2023, the rules changed. So the unique chemistry that created last year's data set could be a one season analyzing, reacting, planning for 2024. But this year it's different because they're reacting to a season that was a sample size of one. So when you hear podcasters and fantasy analysts, when I hear them saying to me, based on what we saw in 2023, this is what we have to do in 2024, I don't think that's going to work for us, because MLB is doing the exact same thing right now, and their view of 2024 might look completely different from what we think 2024 will be. So I think we need to tuck away those 2023 numbers, perhaps even look at them like we looked at 2020. I don't know. I still think it's a somewhat flawed data set. Regardless, I think it will be dangerous to project 2024 by just regressing last year. Assess each player's skills, build next year's projection starting at zero, and I think that's how we need to do it. So that opens up the possibility that Ronald Acuna could hit 25 or 30 home runs. If teams figure out a way to tamp down the running game, maybe Acuna only steals 30 or 40 bases. And batting averages can naturally swing 50 points or more between any two seasons. So just from randomness alone. So does that mean Acuna won't be the top overall pick next year? Well, he will. We know that. The marketplace can't help itself. But if I had to make a bet on him on him versus the field as the number one earner next year, I'll take the field every time. And one of the things in the introduction was a Twitter poll I ran asking that exact question. And the results are kind of revealing. But I think we need to look at it with a more objective eye for next year. That's what I got.
Great stuff, Ron. Yeah, the poll in your intro really stuck out, the answers to that, Acuna versus the field. You also threw a really interesting table on page 2 of your intro. Basically, you looked at the last 20 years of data, and you listed out who was the number one overall ADP entering the season and what was their finish.
Mm-hmm.
And then right next to that is who was the number one at the end of the year and what was their preseason ADP. Not going to give it all away, but it was interesting that only one hitter has ever, or in the last 20 years, I shouldn't say ever,
one player,
repeated as number one in fantasy in back-to-back years. And that was Albert Pujols in 2008, 2009.
Yep.
So it's just interesting to use history as a guide, and that really stuck out to me. Also stuck out to me that Mike Trout was drafted first for 6 straight years, but that's an aside.
Yeah, and didn't finish first any of those years.
And didn't finish first any of those years. The year that Trout finished first was his first full season,
right,
in 2012, and then never got back to that. So just interesting stuff. Thank you very much, Ron. That was a great intro, and the intro itself is must read. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Ed, you are up on your pair of essays, playing time analytics, that you have in this year's forecasters. So go for it.
Cool. Thank you. So last year in the 2023 baseball forecaster, we talked about the start of the future of playing time measurement. And I'm really happy that we were able to kind of follow through over the course of this past year and really get to the point where we're now really talking about like the next level of playing time analytics. So the big thing that we've done since this time last year was really kind of completely overhaul the way that we're even calculating a lot of this stuff. Last year was more of a concept and an idea. And I really just started with kind of season level data and just did some basic breakouts to kind of start from top down. This year, we completely changed how we're doing that. So I'm starting with daily game and lineup data, and that just gives us such a richer data set to play with, and it lets us start to do things like you see on the slide here, which is bringing in opposing starting pitcher handedness splits and really just making the data that much easier to just gather and crunch and things like that, which makes it like a breeze to get like a 5-year history, the kind of thing that you could maybe see in a future forecaster. Even sub-season insights, so just understanding like what's happening within the arc of a season and not just like taking each kind of thing as a final stamp. And then also just enabling us to start really pushing the edge on understanding kind of the year-to-year stability of playing time metrics over time. We'll get into some aging stuff and really just kind of wrap up with a little bit of understanding of projection of playing time versus we're just thinking about the possibilities. So maybe switch it, Ryan. So just as a quick refresher, the building blocks of playing time that we introduced last year are as follows. So we start with total plate appearances, if you go to the next, and it really breaks down into 2 key things. One is called active weeks, which is like whether or not the player was basically on the active roster during that fantasy week. And then the number of plate appearances per active week. Those 2 things multiplied together, plus this little extra thing, which we won't get into today, ends up kind of defining or building up to total plate appearances. Now, within plate appearances per active week, you have another little mini equation, which is basically starts per active week times plate appearances per start. And then this other thing, which again isn't quite as important, called extra plate appearances per active week, which is basically the plate appearances when the person did not start a game. So if you go to the next slide, the 2 things I want you to just kind of remember, one back. There's 2 little shortcuts, right? So active weeks times plate appearances per active week gets you like 99% of the way there for most players. And then active weeks times starts per active week, next slide, Ryan, times plate appearances per start, for most players is still getting you like 94, 95% of all the plate appearances. So pretty much for the rest of this presentation, I just talk about these 3 kind of core building block metrics, and we kind of ignore some of the other stuff. Okay, so from this point forward, we'll start to talk about some of the new things that were introduced in this year's forecaster. Probably most prominent of which is really just understanding the impact of the opposing starting pitcher hand on things like how often players start and how often they come to bat when they start. So there's no way around it. And this is pretty obvious if you think about the decisions you make as a fantasy manager, but opposite a starting pitcher hand impacts starts per active week. But what's really interesting is I think a lot of times we just think of players who are in like kind of like strict platoons, like the Jock Peterson types, or on the flip side, like a Rob Refsnyder type. But when you dig into the numbers, almost every player is in some sort of like mini or micro platoon in some way. So what this chart shows is on the vertical axis it's like the percent of total games started, and the horizontal axis is basically like the percentage of games started versus, or like, did they start more games versus right-handers or more games versus left-handers? So you just immediately see this really wide split, right? So even players that are starting maybe 95% of total games might be starting 100% of games versus right-handers and only like 82% of games versus left-handers. So there's all these little splits depending on up SP hand that are like very prevalent throughout major leagues. And these are the types of things that when you see a player that's kind of struggling to kind of get past like 5.0 or 5.1 starts per active week, which basically means they're sitting one game per week, as opposed to those kind of like lineup stalwarts that are in there like 5.5, 5.6, 5.7 games per week. These are the differences. And now we have the metrics to kind of show players that just kind of can't crack that 80% of the time against righties, or 80% of the time against lefties, or 90 or 100. So if you flip to the next slide, the same thing is true of plate appearances per start. So the couple of big things that are impacted here are a lot of players are in different lineup slots based on the starting pitcher hands. You might have a batter that bats leadoff against lefties, but he gets dropped to 7th versus righties. So those things really, really impact plate appearances per start. There's also like a team component, right? Because some teams are just way better at hitting pitches of a certain hand versus another. So the lineup just turns over that much more, which is a pretty significant factor. And then some players are just more likely to be essentially just taken out of the game as soon as that pitcher is replaced with a reliever of a different hand. So up SP really impacts both of those numbers like quite a bit. So I wanted to kind of tell a story of Kyle Schwarber that I think illustrates basically all the building blocks as well as some of these little things. So this can be a little tricky without builds and without me controlling the slides, but we'll see if we can do it. So Kyle Schwarber basically just like rocked it in terms of playing time in 2023, but it's been kind of an interesting path to get there, right? So in 2019, 610 plate appearances, like pretty solid, which as a quick aside, right? Up until last year, the only one of these numbers that existed is the plate appearances column, right? So, okay, he went from 610 to 224 to 471 to 669 to 720. Like, okay, that's what he did, I guess. We don't really have much more insight into that unless you happen to like be Kyle Schwarber's mom or grandma and you remember all of his details, right? So now we can really see what's been going on. So in 2019, we'll just assume that's a baseline. I'm not going to kind of talk through that, but I'll talk about everything else relative to the prior year. So in 2020, you can see, do your best to keep up with this, Ryan. So his starts per active week
I'm trying to get
really
you here.
jumped.
I got the mouse going,
Right.
so here we go.
All right, thank you. In 2020, his starts per active week jumped up by a half of a start. And if you kind of move over, but his plate appearances per start dropped. So the net was that really on a plate appearances per active week basis, he ended up about the same. It was about an even trade-off. And if you kind of look further over to the right, you can see some of the reasons for that. So between 2019 and 2020, he absolutely exploded in terms of his ability to start games, or his like being allowed to start games versus left-handed pitching. He jumped from 47% of the games to 82% of games, which is really nice. However, the little $R and $L is the mode lineup slot for all of his games. So he went from batting leadoff to batting 4th or 5th. And his team, which is WTMX, is basically the WOBA of the rest of his teammates, essentially, tanked. So it went from being one of the best offenses in the league to a very poor offense, right? So those things kind of contributed to the increase in SAW and the decrease in PAS. Now, fast forward to 2021, he saw pretty much an even, only a slight change in percent games versus lefties. So he basically gave a little bit of that back, but his overall starts per active week stayed the same. But his plate appearances per start jumped back up again. Because if you look over to the right, it wasn't actually because of his lineup slot change. That stayed kind of in the middle of the lineup, but his team was way better again, right? So that alone was enough to jump his plate appearances per start way back up. Unfortunately, he only ended up with 471 plate appearances because it turns out he missed 8 weeks of the season. I don't remember what injury he had. But if you look to the number to the right of that, his 24.4 plate appearances per active week is really, really strong. And it turns out that it was a very good harbinger of what was to come in the next season. So in 2022, go back over to percentage of games started versus left-handers. He jumped back up to 91%, career high. I have no idea why they keep playing him against left-handed pitchers. He does okay, I guess. And he was also allowed to bat leadoff again, both against righties and against lefties, and had a roughly league average offense behind him. but his starts per active week went up a little bit. His plate appearances per start went up a little bit, and he was on the roster for every single week. And that led him to do a then career high 669 plate appearances. And you might think, well, Kyle Schwarber is not the type of person that's ever going to get more than that, right? Well, it turns out we would have been wrong if we tried to guess that, because if you look in the percentage of games versus lefties, he somehow basically started almost all but like 1 or 2 games, I think, versus left-handed starters. He continued to bat leadoff pretty much every game, and the Phillies' offense improved a bit as well, kind of pushing his PAS into the stratosphere, his SAW into the stratosphere, and he also was on the roster for all 27 active weeks. That 26.7 plate appearances per active week is like astounding. Like that's about as high as you can really push it to kind of cover the entire season. And that is how a player maximizes his playing time. And these metrics are pretty much how you show that and understand that type of thing. So we basically now have all of these metrics for every player. But there's more. So I won't quite go into quite as much detail on this one, but I tried to think through like what are some ways we can kind of see. It's mostly beneficial for hindsight. So I don't think this is going to be the kind of metric that's super useful, kind of like mid-season and things like that. But I kind of go back to like players that have like identical-ish like plate appearances, like in hindsight. So Ahmed Rosario and Jake Berger. You might remember their stories roughly over the course of the past year because they're pretty fresh still, right? But like their seasons could not have been like more different once you get past the total plate appearances number. So I think just for the efficiency's sake, you can kind of read the left side of the chart, but I do want to kind of spend a little bit of time on the subseason insights. So the numbers off to the right are basically the max of his like rolling kind of 5 weeks of starts per active week. So this is basically like following his kind of trajectory and path over the course of the year. Was there ever any point during the season that a player like really started a lot of games or got a lot of plate appearances per start, or really had like a really low point? And then the trend number is basically just like you just take the total arc of the season. Was it generally pointing up or generally pointing down? So Ahmed Rosario, if you recall, got traded mid-season, and he basically stopped starting games, right? So you can see for Ahmed Rosario, his MNS, which is basically minimum starts per active week, was 2.1. So there was a point in the season where he just was not a viable fantasy player at all. And his trend was actually the worst trend of any player that had a total of 425 plate appearances, I believe. So he basically, over the course of the season, if you just kind of went April to May to June, et cetera, again, all averages, but it basically meant he dropped his starts per active week by a half a start, like kind of per month. He basically went from something like, he might have gone from 5.5 to 5 to 4.5 to 4 to 3.5 to 3. He basically went from starting every day kind of interesting fantasy player to totally unusable. And now we have metrics to kind of show how that happened. And Jake Berger, on the other hand, had the complete opposite story, right? So you can see his trend kind of steadily went up throughout the year, both in terms of SAW, which is the TRS metric, and as well as plate appearances per start, which is that TRP metric at the end. So won't spend any more time on those two metrics or on those group of metrics, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can start to unpack.
Yeah, and just to interject before I go to the next slide, like that's super interesting because, I mean, in Jake Berger's case, if we're trying to project playing time for 2024, could we, in theory, throw out what we saw because he is still on the Marlins, and can we assume that those playing time trends that we saw with Miami will continue? In Ahmed Rosario's case, I believe he's a free agent, so depending on where he signs, which kind of can we use the LA version of playing time to project for him for 2024, right, or do we go back to what we saw from Rosario's playing time trends in Cleveland and go with that for more of a 2024 playing time projection, kind of depending on where he signs? There's just so many different, I don't know, places and ways
you might call them scenarios. And the very last thing I'll talk about will be exactly that, which is like, now that we have like the language to talk about these things, you can just start to say, all right, well, like, I think this might happen. And I think this might also happen. I think it's maybe 70% likely of the first thing, 30% likely of the second thing. Just do the simple math on those metrics, and you like outspits 525 plate appearances for Ahmed Rosario, which is a very defensible playing time projection, as opposed to wild-ass guessing.
Good, because I just drafted Ahmed Rosario in my current draft and hold. I would go for 525. Do you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, but you skipped one, I think.
Oh, did I?
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. So in terms of year-over-year stability, right? Because I think everything up to this point has really just been thinking in terms of hindsight, but I really wanted to start to understand how we can use some of this stuff on a forward-looking basis. So just looking at just how these things, how each of these building block metrics kind of correlates with itself from year to year, they're all really stable, both looking at the entire player pool, as well as if you look at more of like a condensed player pool, such as like only among like positive value players in year one as measured by like a 15-team mixed league or something like that. There's one grand exception to this, and it kind of relates back to a point that Ron had just made, which is that active weeks has almost no correlation with itself. Like once you kind of, it very much does for the entire player pool, right? So it's just like, because it takes into account rookies and there's kind of this overall like arc of people that kind of come into the league and leave the league. But if you just look at players that were like already sort of useful fantasy players, there's almost no correlation between how often they were not on the roster from year one to year two. So plate appearances per active week is very correlative from year to year for amongst that player group, but active weeks is not. And you can see this kind of evidenced in the second bullet, which is that year one plate appearances per active week correlates with total year two plate appearances better than year one plate appearances itself correlates with year two plate appearances. So, light bulbs may be going off, and it kind of gets you to something that resembles this last bullet, which is like high plate appearances per active week players like are really, really interesting. If you kind of like I'm not saying this is a good idea to project them for 27 active weeks, but if you think about something like Steamer 600 or something like that, people are always like, well, what if they just got a full season? Like, well, someone like Jock Peterson is never going to get 600 plate appearances, but he really might get 27 active weeks. And a lot of these players might get something like 27 active weeks. So that list over to your right is a list of players that started, that were active for no more than 18 weeks, but all had really, really strong plate appearances per active week. And if you kind of wish cast them to get 27 active weeks, many of whom is a very reasonable thing to do. I know there's a lot of chatter about players like Nolan Jones and Ellie De La Cruz and Zach Geloff. Like that's basically what their full season as measured by active weeks plate appearances would have been had they just been on the roster for the entire year. It's worth noting that some of these players were on this list last year as well. So it's not a foolproof plan. Like Riley Green, I think, and Vinny Pasquantino maybe were both on this list last year as well. So spend a minute talking through aging curves because they're kind of interesting eye candy, but they're also really kind of useful to think about. Like players really do have like an arc in terms of like active weeks is basically they come into the league over kind of the early parts of their 20s, and then they kind of have some sense of stability, but maybe injuries start to kick in a little bit, and then kind of starting around age 31 for actually all of these metrics, you start to see a little bit of a taper off and then a little bit of a sharper decline. Plate appearances per active week in the upper right is players basically start playing at roughly about as much as they're going to play as measured by a plate appearances per active week metric throughout their early career, and then they start to kind of gradually tail off. And you can start to see why if you look at the bottom two, which is starts per active week and plate appearances per start. I'll just go to plate appearances per start. So basically, a lot of players, and you can hypothesize lots of reasons, right? They're young, they're fast, they're whatever, so they kind of get chances, higher up in the lineup. So basically, the earliest parts of a career are best for plate appearances per start. On starts per active week, I won't talk about it here because I want to talk about it on the next slide. So where it gets really, really interesting is when you split by opposite SP handedness. Ryan, if you go to the next slide, you can start to see a really interesting divergence, right? So this is basically the typical aging curve, but it splits by the play, like the darker line is percentage of games started versus the opposite hand. So right-handed batters against left-handed pitchers or left-handed batters against right-handed pitchers. I excluded switch hitters from this curve. And then the lighter line is the percentage of games started versus same hand starting pitchers. So you can actually see that against opposite hand starting pitchers, the curve is really flat, right? They pretty much can stay starting lots of games against the people that they're better at hitting. The problem is that teams basically stop letting them start games against same-handed pitching. It starts a bit, right kind of post peak, but it really starts to kick in around age 32. So the player I think I picked on in the forecaster was 32-year-old to be right-handed hitter Hunter Renfroe, who unceremoniously got booted from his team at the end of last year. But he's kind of emblematic of the type of player that might just stop being fantasy relevant really, really fast. It's unfortunate that happened in season last year for those like me who had him. But okay, so can we project playing time accurately now? No, not really still. And we may never be able to do that. But I think what we can do is really start to create better baseline plate appearance projections, because I think we can get better at projecting the individual building blocks and then just using that formula that I showed at first to just reconstitute that back together. And then I think we can start to think about all the different factors. It could be anything, right? It's contract status, it's number of options left, it's competition, on the field, it's whatever, lineup pressures, defensive problems, whatever, anything that you think might impact a player. You don't have to just kind of thumb to the wind, just try to figure out I'll just remove 20 plate appearances from his total. Like, you can now say, well, I think logically that thing is going to cause him to bat 9th in the lineup instead of 5th. And then you could say, okay, well, there's also I didn't talk about this in the article at all, but there's math you could do to figure out, okay, like what are the average plate appearances and stuff like that based on lineup slot. So you can ultimately get back to his plate appearances per start might go down. And then all the math works out to just kind of spit out a new number. So you just have to think about your direct logical assumptions that you're making about what's happening for that player. And then we can translate that into plate appearance terms. So I thought one last thing we could do is just pick on a player. And the player I use in the book is Ha-Seong Kim. And I kind of presented his data for his 3 years in MLB. I put in a fake baseline projection. The forecaster itself actually projects Ha-Seong Kim for 609 plate appearances. My personal baseline projection, just based on kind of thinking through the numbers and whatnot, ended up being 572. But the whole idea here is that if you look at the bottom 3 rows, like if you were pretty optimistic about Ha-Seong Kim's chances to kind of stay in at number 1 slot in the lineup, both against left-handed batters, where he's actually pretty decent, and against right-handed batters, which he is really not good, which is like a significant risk for him. And if you think that he'll keep playing like 85+% of the time versus right-handers, which again, some people may not think so, but if you think he can kind of push the edge there, that he might not only kind of repeat what he did last year, which is a career high in plate appearances, he might also improve that potentially. But there's also pretty easy scenarios where you could see he loses in active weeks. Now he's down, and this is the Sauer scenario. He's down to 25 active weeks. I really think he's going to bat lower in the lineup, like 7th versus right-handers, and he's only going to start less than 80% of the time versus right-handers. All you have to do is make a couple of those little assumptions, and you can also kind of make the Padres overall like a worse team. And then he immediately drops to something like 515 or 520. And you could just say, what if he just completely falls off a cliff? And you might think that if you look deeply into his performance against right-handers, there's a case to be made that he really doesn't even get 500 plate appearances next year. And then to my point a couple of minutes ago, you could just put weights on these scenarios and kind of do the quick math to say, if it's 40% likely of my base scenario and 20% of each of the other scenarios, do that math and it works out to, I did the math, by the way, it works out to 550 plate appearances for Ha-Seong Kim. So these are the types of things that we can now do. And I think the idea is to start to enable subscribers of our tools and things like that to do the same. So that is all I got, but happy to answer questions.
Man, yeah. If there's any questions for Ed in the chat, type those in. We'll get to them either now or at the end of the show. But I could spend the whole hour talking about this, multiple hours probably. You made a really good point, Ed, about like, are we going to be able to project playing time accurately in the future? No. Like, I don't know how we project the fact that this player is going to get hit in the hand, or these 10 players are going to get hit in the hand in 2024 and break their wrist and miss 6 weeks. We know it's going to happen. To who? We don't, but we can I think, do a lot better. And I have not seen this really anywhere. We can do a lot better at those building blocks, the platoons, the team, the lineup, and the plate appearances per active week. So really cool stuff, man.
Thank you.
Very much encourage everyone to kind of sink your teeth into these essays in the forecaster and use those examples. I believe the Ha-Seong Kim example is written out in your piece in the forecaster too. So you can go back and check that out in more detail. All right. Next up, our favorite player boxes from the 2024 forecaster. I believe we have 4 of these lined up. I'm not sure. And Ray and Brent are going to go back and forth walking through our favorite boxes. First one up is CJ Abrams.
Thanks, Ryan. And thanks, Ed. And just to echo Ed's last point, we'll talk a little bit later about the new Baseball HQ, but one of the other things we're getting out of a new website is a website that is much more easily customized and able to integrate new tools like this. So I can go online here on the never forgetting platform that is YouTube and say, yes, we are going to get this stuff on the website. It's coming this year. We'll talk a little bit more about timelines for the new website toward the end of the show here, but we're going to get Ed's stuff up and running on the site as soon as we can. I sat in the room with Ed where he did this, the expanded version of this presentation in First Pitch, Arizona, a month and a half ago, and I can say without exaggeration, I've been thinking about it ever since. So it's coming. But let's jump over to CJ Abrams. I pulled the Abrams box because a couple of reasons. One of the first things that came to mind is one of the first boxes I wanted to see when the initial boxes sort of get burped out of Excel. I had a conversation on the last episode of HQ Radio of the Year with Todd Zola and, of course, Patrick Davitt. We were talking about 2024 surgers or guys who were going to jump up the ADP, and I suggested Abrams coming out of his second half, which we'll get to here in a second. But I just loved as much as I love the data in these boxes, I also love the narrative stories. And the story about Abrams that I just love from this year is the July 4th weekend. You might remember that the Reds and newly emerging Ellie De La Cruz were in DC, and Ellie was just running rampant on the Nats all weekend. It was the weekend where I think he actually stole second, third, and home on 3 straight pitches in one game. And then Dave Martinez threw at him, as I recall. This was the story of baseball throughout the weekend. And I just picture CJ Abrams sitting there watching Ellie De La Cruz running all over the place, or maybe Dave Martinez walking by him in the dugout being like, can't you freaking do what he's doing? Come on, you're fast. Go be that. And Abrams apparently was just like, oh, okay, I could do that. Because from that weekend on, he just went bananas. And Brent pointed out when we were looking at this box, is right in the forecaster commentary, that is also right around the same weekend when Martinez moved him from batting 8th and 9th to batting him up to the leadoff spot, and he just went bananas from there. But it wasn't just the lineup position change. If you give me the next boxes, Ryan, the skills actually got better too. Importantly, the kind of skills you want to see emerge for a leadoff hitter. He put the bat on the ball a lot more in the second half, and largely because of that contact rate growth, his hard contact followed along as well, which, if you look a little bit to the right and highlight it, there's a little bit better quality of contact there. We know the guy's fast, but if you take 39% stolen base attempt rate for the whole year at 92% success, nobody can throw him out. We know he's going to run. So why would you ever tell him not to run when he's going to be successful 92% of the time? So even with 38 bags in the second half and 341 plate appearances, our projection here of 52 in a full season in the leadoff role with these emerging skills actually feels kind of conservative, right? Which is why we threw the up 70 stolen bases into the box too, because there's a ceiling even beyond that. and the full commentary in the box talks about future first round player, et cetera. Because I mean, he's 23. This is just bananas. And I loved seeing this box because I still had the story from July 4th weekend in my head, and then seeing when you see the box and you see it just validate everything that came along with it. That's the kind of thing I get super excited about.
I don't think I've ever seen a second half. If we look down beneath the SBA and SB percentages, the second half version of that,
51 and 95.
51%. So yeah, and so yes, everyone knew he was running. That's the 51% stolen base attempt rate. Yet he was 95% successful.
I think Adalberto Mondesi comes to mind. Like a couple of his peak years, I think he was scraping 50% there, but he was not a 95% success guy.
Right. Exactly. That's fascinating. I did not pick up on that second half success rate. That is that's unreal. That's unreal.
Stop me if you can. No, you cannot.
And they cannot.
I think Mondesi might have had full seasons higher than 50%.
He may have,
yeah.
It was wild.
So, all right, great stuff. Actually, before we move on, anything else on CJ, Ray? You good to go?
I'm good here unless anybody else wants to chime in.
We'll go from CJ to CY, Cy Young, Blake Snell, Brent.
This one's actually still me.
Oh, this one's still you. My bad.
Yeah, I did 2 in a row for some reason. Brent will go for 2 after this. So I just, the impetus for talking about this box is a couple of things. The thing that jumped out when I first looked at it is the hit and strand rate that come along with the career best 2.25 ERA. You can go over and look at the 2.25 ERA and the 3.62x ERA. We see gaps like that all the time, right? And usually when you see an ERA that's much better than the skills, we're all conditioned at this point to go over to the hit and strand rate and the home run per fly and see some favorable numbers there. And sure enough, 27% hit and 85% strand is the kind of favorable number you need to support an ERA that's a run and a quarter lower than your expected ERA, whether we're talking about a 2.25 ERA that's a run and a half better than what we expected, or even a 4 ERA that's a run and a half better than somebody who was terrible and deserved a 5.5, right? So that part's not new. The part that kind of struck me about this was usually when you get those 85% strand rates, you get that he was just keeping the ball in the park, and you'll see a home run per fly of like 4% or something like that. And for whatever reason, the ball, Ron talks about the errant gusts of wind. The errant gusts of wind were all in his favor, and all the balls got caught at the warning track. And when you see that 4% home run per fly, you're like, okay, I understand how he got the 85% strand rate. This is not that case. The home run per fly of 11% for Snell, you can see it's actually a little bit better than the expected metric, but that's still 15 home runs. And I had to go look this up because when I was looking at this box, because it was such a head scratcher, I needed the actual breakdown of what happened. So he gave up 15 home runs with a couple guys on base when the 15 home runs were hit. So 20 runs scored on home runs for Snell this year. But with a 2.25 ERA, he only gave up 45 runs all year. 20 of them scored on home runs, which leaves 25 runs, obviously. Those 25 runs were scored, the ones that were not scored on the home runs, the 25 runs that scored with balls in play was out of a remaining 209 runners who got on base by not hitting a home run. So like his strand rate, if you take the home runs out, was legitimately like 89% of runners who actually just got on base, he stranded there, which is, I mean, the thing I love about this is we've got all our fancy newfangled metrics, and Ed's always raising the bar on new things here. Hit and strand are among the oldest things we have in our toolbox at this point. And that's kind of all we need to explain Blake Snell. And I love it because, like, in this age of over and analyzing and pitch mix changes and shaping and seam shifted wake and all this stuff, I've seen some actual, a couple of analysts I've seen make references on Twitter to how this is some kind of a skill for Snell, that he changes his arsenal and throws different pitches with runners on base, and that's how he strands so many runners, which is just the perfect segue into like the old joke of, why don't we just build the whole plane out of the black box? It's like, if he can do that whenever he wants to, just don't put the runners on first base to begin with. obviously that's not a skill. Um, so, of course, we know from some of our oldest metrics in our arsenal, hit and strand rate, that Snell's ERA only has to go in one direction. The other aspect of this box, though, is Snell also spiked his innings, and he threw 180 innings last year, which is I'm not sure if it's a career high, but it was a career high for the 5 years in the box, and it wasn't close. He's never, he's 51 innings over his prior high from 2021 in San Diego. So we got to expect some innings pullback. And I highlighted the ERA and xERA columns because, as is so often the case, expected ERA kind of takes out the noise of all those hit, strand, home run per fly variations. And that xERA column on the rightmost of the blue columns there, those numbers trade in a pretty narrow range. He's a mid threes expected ERA guy. And if you take a mid threes expected ERA guy and you map that to that innings history that we look at, that's how you get down the bottom, to the projection column. And we settled at 145 innings at a, mid threes ERA. Sometimes this isn't that hard, but I just thought it was hysterical because of all this stuff going on with Blake Snell. It's just even still, like, see people online suggesting that he's got some magical ability to strand runners at a higher rate than the rest of the world. And no, he doesn't.
I'm muted. This is not 2020 anymore. I should be over that. I also look at I like to look at in these boxes too. I like to compare years and kind of see how does this compare. The 2023, yes, the innings are different, but the 2023 Cy Young version of Snell and the 2021 version, exact same strikeout minus walk, pretty much exact same walk rate, exact same K rate. To go back to what you were saying, Ray, look at the hit and strand rate and the difference there.
Yeah, that's what he looks like with normal luck, right?
Pretty much same exact skills that that Snell showed in 2021.
And hey, who knows where he's going to pitch next year? It might be a ballpark that has balls landing on the other side of the fence a little more often than Petco.
Yep, could be. Could very well be. And it probably won't be Petco. I think we can assume that.
Probably not.
Juan Soto trade. All right, great stuff. Brent, you're up next. Brian Hayes.
Yeah, I'm always some of the most interesting boxes to me every year are consist of the ones that we kind of from players that we think we know about, and there's a certain narrative, at least for me anyway, that's in my head about that over time, and so to see some surprising changes or whatever in these boxes always get me interested. So the first example of that is Brian Hayes. We know that over the past several years since he's been in the league, he's had a spotty health history, kind of on and off the ILs, had some problems, has a C health grade, and then mainly has been I kind of viewed as a disappointment since that the excitement of his 95 plate appearance 2002 when he kind of burst on the scene. And kind of a quick scan of his surface stats there highlighted in green, kind of support that. It's I don't have the dollar figures on here, but it's it's a $16 season. He was $13, $15, $10 the past several years, so kind of right in that range. It's kind of a meh year. And you could even think about it as being sort of a down year because certainly his, he's not been a big, powerful third baseman, but has always given a good bit of steals, and those were, of course, cut in half. But looking a little deeper, there's certainly something interesting going on. And the first thing I looked at or noticed was kind of this BPX string, where at the end of last year was he almost 3 times better, more than 3 times better than he was the past couple of years, in comparison to his peers there. And that 182, BPX kind of 82 points, percentages higher than a average player. And a lot of this comes from a huge second half that he had, of course. And again, we'll start with the surface stats. The 10 homers, the 295 batting average and kind of just work our way across that second half line, you see that one of the things that has been frustrating for those that have rostered Hayes is the big ground ball rate he's always had there. You look up that column, 48%, 57%, 49%, and especially in the second half here, something has changed for sure. Starting again, even in the first half, 37% fly balls and then 41% in the second half. And that's also, very much reflected in his launch angle, which is the middle of the QBAB figures there. Coming into this year, we knew he hit the ball hard. He was always an exit velocity leader all the years there in the majors. But the D, the F, and the F there in his first 3 years, again, just sort of reinforces that he just hit way too many grounders. And again, that's something that first half of the year, he was that certainly had improved. And by the second half of the year, got into the very good range, and very much his barrel rate followed. And just keeping, again, just stepping to the right, again, XPX and PX up in the 130s. The home run for fly ball is just all working. There's just a lot of really good signs for him in the second half. I know, we have to be somewhat careful. It's just 222 plate appearances and all that. But when we see stuff like this, where all of those power metrics, which is kind of what we're looking for, knowing that he has always been, a top kind of performer in exit velocity, but not much else. When you see a lot of those other things kind of all on the rise, it's kind of what leads us to a, with health, kind of course, an upside of a 280 batting average and 20 plus home runs. I just think it's an interesting look at, again, one of these players that, possibly on the surface didn't stand out. But when you look a little bit further, there, could be some pretty exciting things happening for Brian Hayes, I think, here as he enters his, kind of peak age for his career.
It's interesting to see that. And you mentioned, Brent, last year, 2022, the 20 stolen bases. I wonder that's an interesting thing to me. I wrote a 2020 in the Forecaster this year, wrote a piece about the stolen base environment and how it all went up. Hayes was like not one of the few, but it's just interesting to see, given the age and that he's entering peak, to see that stolen base conversion rate plummet, kind of opposite from what we saw in the league. So just interesting. But that second half power surge is pretty wild to see. Yeah, some hope for Pirates fans out there.
There you go.
Some.
And so the second guy we'll look at, kind of on the pitcher side, sort of similar, is Nick Pivetta. Now, of course, Pavetta's been kind of at this for much longer, so maybe his, what we think of him is even ingrained further. But I'm still surprised when I look over and see he's still just 31 years old. And, if you kind of know his narrative from last year, it was not a consistent sort of usage year for him. He started in the rotation. They pulled him out, and he was kind of a multi-inning reliever. And then he went back into the rotation in late August or September, and just had an amazing kind of 5-start finish to end the year. But the first thing we notice overall is, like, regardless of the role, I mean, just looking across at his 2023, just how good it was overall. It was a combination of kind of the best skills and the best results of his career, from the K total, 183, to the ERA and WHIP. I mean, again, comparing those surface stats to what he's done, what you can see before in the 4 years previous in the box, you can see how he's helping your team. And when you look further, again, a lot of other metrics support that too. The K percentage, the swinging strike rate went up, and just going, across that row. When you also noticed that highlighted there in the green is his base on ball rate is just improved also throughout the 5-year scan there, as well as kind of in that first to second half delineation too. I mean, it just keeps getting better, and I think it's really encouraging, especially that while his base on ball percentage kind of, he seemed to underperform what his expected base on ball percentage says. By the end of the year, they were much closer to each other and, improving at the same time. And then the red kind of just supporting that also from the strikeout side. Again, just got a lot more swinging strikes this year overall in the season. And again, something that grew in the first and second half, and then the K percentage itself following a lot of the same patterns. And then we look at the second line as a whole, the second half line as a whole, similar to Hayes, in that, obviously in that line, there's some relief pitcher numbers in there where he was throwing shorter stints, but you learn about, again, a pitch mix change that he employed late in the season, using a cutter more, and being able to mix that up in his final 5 starts. And I think there's really some, just some compelling reasons to think that as he kind of enters his age 31 year in 2024, that there could be a career year coming. And so we just kind of, again, in the book, in the commentary there, just note that, with his expected bases on ball progression, the velocity K bump, and the workhorse frame, it just points to a potential upside of a 3.25 ERA. And you can even see in the base projection itself, we're already looking at we expect 181 innings and 208 strikeouts with a sub-4 ERA. So again, just kind of looking deeper in the boxes, using those to as Ron has always liked to say, kind of wipe the slate clean and look at these players with fresh eyes, and opens up some possibilities as we get into draft season here.
Selfishly, one of my favorite moments, fantasy baseball moments of 2023, was outbidding Ray for Nick Pivetta in Tout Wars Mixed, right around halfway through the season, and right after Fabran got a little nasty gram text from Ray, and then
too soon
enjoyed the fruits of that labor. So thanks for adding that slide, Brent, so I could rub that, twist that knife one more time.
I'll help anywhere I can.
Right. Yeah. One interesting thing, so you mentioned this in the box or in your kind of your talk, it was a pitch mix change. And I just want to say, or ask in general, we try to, in the commentaries, in the boxes, we try to stick to the statistics and the stats that are actually in the box. I feel like pitch mix changes, and we know we don't have usage rates and individual pitch stuff in these boxes, but I do feel like one place where we kind of, bend the rule is around a pitch mix change, especially when we see in Pivetta's case, a change in skills. And so is that something that, we try to do and tend to do more so than not with changes?
I think a little bit, yeah. And I think about it in terms of sometimes on the hitter side with, some sort of mechanical change that they may have made too. When I think about it, either writing a box or editing a box, is that sort of information, I think about it more in a supplemental way. Not that I would bring that forward and use up all the space in the box talking about each specific thing, but more as a supporting possibility that this was also something that was going on, that that is not quantified in the box, that may point to a certain outcome over a longer period of time.
Yep. And just on the flip side too, I know Ron, all of us pretty much harp on this. Anytime there's an injury that may have affected,
Sure.
the second half plummet or that sort of thing, we try to always call that out in the box, even though we don't put the injury info in the box specifically. We have a separate section for it. But
it's important context to kind of to note from time to time.
Yep. All right. We got a couple questions so far, and if anyone will kind of pivot to Q&A before I make good on our little tease. I guess the first one, this one just came in from Eric Leggett, so I'll put Brent on the spot in terms of prospect wise. What do you think of some of the top prospects, Holiday, Churio, for the 2024 season? Eric asked, and just to paint some context on this, I've been drafting, and a few of us have been drafting so far. Jackson Churio is probably going to be a top 150 pick by the time we get to March, given that he signed the contract, and he will likely be on the opening day roster. And Jackson Holiday is pricey as well. But Brent, we'll get your thoughts on those two guys for 2024.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a conundrum for me. I mean, I think those two especially are if you're gonna play in the prospect pool for a redraft like that, to me, you want to go after the top guys. I think they have a better shot of performing. I mean, you think about last year, Henderson, Corbin Carroll, Julio Rodriguez from a couple of years ago, guys that all sort of similarly had a certain amount of hype around them. But where they go and kind of how, and in this case, the fact that neither Holiday or Churio have played a major league game yet does give me some pause, just from just make them a riskier kind of investment that way. So I realize I'm hedging a little bit, but that's well, he asked me what I think, so that's what the question is. So that's how I'm answering it. I think it's a balance of those two things.
Question from John Wilder, and I'll kind of, this was a Dan Marcus box in the forecaster about Ahmed Rosario, who Ed kind of talked about on the playing time side. I'll take this one, and if anyone wants to add on to it, Dan pretty much ended the box saying pay for double-digit stolen bases and a decent batting average floor, but nothing more. So that to me, not screams, but kind of hints at a better year than what we saw in 2023 for sure. But Ahmed Rosario hasn't hit more than 11 home runs since 2019. I don't think we see that even coming back in 2024. I don't know if any of you all have anything to add to Ahmed Rosario. Obviously, where he signs will dictate quite a bit as well.
If I'm not mistaken, I saw a tweet or X or whatever we're calling it today with him at Driveline. So all bets are off.
Shirtless at Driveline. Double points.
Exactly.
Double points.
So first Driveline hype of the offseason, at least the first one I saw. So, yep.
Question for Ray, not player wise, but more, I guess, business wise. Is there digital version of the forecaster available?
That could mean three different things. So let me answer all of them. For those who have annual renewing orders for the forecaster print edition, as Brent mentioned at the top, Brent or you, Ryan, mentioned at the top, you got the PDF the day before Thanksgiving. However, email is not 100% reliable. I always hear from a few people, even now when the physical book arrives in our mailbox, like, can I get the PDF too? And yes, you could. In fact, I told you we tried to tell you 3 weeks ago. So if you have an annual standing order and you don't have the PDF, send us an email at support and I'll get it to you. If you bought the one-time order, the PDF will be available in January. And the third category, which might be what Phil is asking about, is the digital only option, the electronic files only, no print version. We don't open that up for sale until people have their physical books in hand to try to protect that investment. But I did set up the digital only purchase option today. So if that's what Phil was looking for, that is now available on the site.
Very good.
Surprisingly complicated answer to an easy question.
I feel like I should record that because I think we get that question.
I have a cut and paste in my
cut and paste note
customer service inbox that kind of covers all of that. Yes.
Ron, you kind of answered this in the chat already, but Randy was curious about just in general your plans for Babs in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, Babs, basically the concept and then the calculations and everything will be unchanged in 2024. However, we're discontinuing the subscription product for next year, and it's going to be a series of one-off reports with a lot of different slices and dices of the data that we haven't done before. Moving away from looking and focusing on the asset groups and looking more at the rounds and the marketplace and trying to focus more on leveraging the way the marketplace runs. It's kind of complicated to talk about here, but we'll be sending out notes in a few weeks that describes it in more detail. It's actually pretty interesting.
Excellent. And then Ron, while we have you, I probably should have introed this at the beginning, but Jim, just this isn't a question, but he just says, looking forward to reading Ron's book. And for those of you who may be wondering, well, isn't that the Baseball Forecaster? Yes, but this is Ron's other book.
The other book, yes.
Yeah, the Fantasy Expert, which I have already read, and I will say it's a fantastic read. But Ron, I'll let you kind of give intros on the on when folks can get the Fantasy Expert book.
Yeah, the official pub date for that book is February 20th. We had some advanced copies available at First Pitch Arizona, which a bunch of people were able to get their hands on. It's essentially a historical memoir of the first 25 years of the fantasy baseball industry, how I got involved, and profiles of a lot of the writers and experts who basically built this industry in the 1980s and 90s. It was my pandemic project, so I'm happy it's finally in print. And Triumph Books, which publishes The Forecaster, was nice enough to publish this book as well. So it will be available in hard copy February 20th.
Tons of cool tidbits in that one. One of which, just selfishly, did not know John Hunt was a fellow Virginia Tech grad. I picked up that tidbit in during the book, so had to throw that one in there. Question, baseball wise, long term at second base, Zach Geloff or Matt McLean? It's an interesting question. I'll throw it out to you guys, but I know park factors play a big role, at least for 2024, given those two in lineups. But who are you guys taking long term between those two guys, those two second basemen?
I don't have an answer to the long-term question, or even who I prefer from a skill standpoint. But they were the two top names in that chart that I showed earlier in terms of plate appearances per active week, both above 26 last year, which is just crazy. That's a really high number. So these are the elite of the elite full-time players when they were on the roster last year.
Wow, that's was that a planted question?
It was not. That's why I was surprised when I saw it.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's pretty impressive in that trash Oakland lineup too.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Balin says, heard a rumor that all forecaster writers are getting Rivians for Christmas. Yay or nay? I would love for that to be true. Those trucks are awesome, but I don't think that's in the Baseball HQ budget. Especially because
it was trucks for everybody or a new website, one of the two.
Yeah, exactly. And that was my lead-in, but especially because we are using the budget on a new website. So I teased this at the beginning, but I'm going to have Ray kind of talk through. Ray sent me a couple screenshots before we started, and I'm going to pull those up now. I have to unshare and then share. But we are working diligently on, and Ray and Brent, I'll let you kind of take it from here, on a new website this offseason.
Yeah, super excited about this. Brent and I are literally having calls with the programmers every day now. We're at that point in the process where they have just a bazillion questions, of course, and we have things we want to see, and then they tell us things we couldn't even imagine that we could have, and we're like, oh yeah, we want that. So it's definitely a fun part of the process. This is a quick look at what a actual 2020s homepage edition of Baseball HQ might look like. One thing I wanted to call out here is we're actually, I'm very conscious of the experience that we all have when you go to a website that you've used forever, and they do one of these redesigns and suddenly you cannot find anything, and it is among the most frustrating experiences known to man, right? We're not doing that. We might do that eventually. I kid. But we're not doing that. These menus, the top are, almost exactly what they are now. You will find all your articles in the same place. They work a little bit differently in that, like, you don't see the articles actually at the top, but the sections, the organizing of the content is going to be very, very familiar, so that if you pop in, either it's your morning in HQ and you want to do your reading, you can do that. Or if you're flying to the site on Friday night, I just want to print out a sheet before I go to the draft, you'll be able to find that pretty easily too. So we're going to make it look way more modern, but we're not going to overturn the apple cart to get there. So that's what I wanted to show in this top half of the homepage. There's obviously a lot more below the fold there that we'll show in the future. But then the other cool thing we get out of this, if Ryan goes to his second and third pictures there, is that very same website. We're not getting an app because that's kind of not how you do this anymore. But the very same website, you can literally, I got this view here, which is totally different, just by taking my web browser and shrinking it. If you shrink it down to look like a phone, or if you go to the website on the phone, it just condenses everything naturally. They call that, in the industry, they call that responsive design. The website detects what kind of a screen you're on and renders it appropriately. So this turns the site into a big scroll where you get article, article, article. And if you use, here's a term that Brent learned this week, if you use the hamburger menu, which is what they call that 3 lines up at the top right.
Never heard of that either. Let me throw it up here. I need to pivot a little bit back and forth. I'd never heard the term, and I use it all the time, but I've never heard the term hamburger menu.
But if you click on that thing on the right, here's how you get to all the sections in the site that we were just showing across the top menu. So, it's a little bit, there's a little bit more tapping involved in that, the navigation, because you got less space to work with, but the layout where you think things are is still going to make a lot of sense. So you'll still be able to, if you want to flip through the morning articles on your phone on the train on the way to work, you can easily do that. So yeah, we're super excited. I don't want to be throwing out dates yet because there's still a lot of work to do, but it's got to be worth it whenever we get there.
Yeah, there's a lot of, you just talked mainly, or just showed mainly about the articles, a lot of the tools and stats, and the way that we'll get them will be just tons better. Being able to slice and dice our information in a bunch of different ways. And yeah, it's pretty exciting on a bunch of levels. Again, some of those mock-ups will change some once we get into production, but we're definitely excited, and I know there'll be a lot of people there that'll be excited to just check it out as well.
Yep. And in fact, one final teaser, I mentioned we're on daily phone calls with the programming team now, and today's daily phone call was about the new version of the Mac tool, which has the holy grail features that we've been asking for forever now, that actually will go to your league website on RT Sports or ESPN or Yahoo or the NFBC and just suck in all your rosters for not just your team, but the entire league, and show you reports on not just your roster and your team stats, but, oh, hey, I need to go figure out a list of who free agent second basemen are this Sunday that I can go place a bid on. 2 clicks and it knows who's a free agent in your league. It's fabulous. So it's going to be great. We're going to get there sometime between now and opening day. So stay tuned, and when we have more stuff to show, we'll be showing it on the site.
Well put. Exciting times ahead. But for tonight, I think that wraps us up. Appreciate the questions, the comments. Appreciate Ron, Brent, Ray, and Ed, your time. Keep checking those mailboxes, people. The forecaster is coming if it hasn't come already. But signing off for 2024. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you out there soon.
Thank you.
This way. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.